We're now on the top of Daf Lamed Hey Amid Beis, and we concluded Daf Lamed Hey Amid Aleph with an analysis of Reish Lakish in the case of Mei Peros. Here we want to mention that if he used fruit juices instead of water in his dough and he made a bread out of it, Reish Lakish says that you cannot use that as matzah if you prevented it from leavening, because Mei Peros eno machmitzin. Now, there's a major machlokus Rishonim. A whole school of Rishonim say ein machmitzin in Reish Lakish means that it's not real chimutz, it's what you call a secondary chimutz. It's close to chimutz. It's what we call chametz nuksha, and they hold that chametz nuksha is osur doraisa, so that if he adds peros, made peros with his dough, and he bakes it and he allows it to leaven, that is a partial process of leavening, and therefore he would be chayav on a doraisa level according to those Rishonim if he makes it into chametz and he eats it. Rabbeinu Tam says no. Ein machmitzah means there's no chimutz whatsoever, and therefore you would not be chayav at all. In any event, this has nothing to do, says the Gemara, with the case of himcho ugmaho, which means if he took chametz gomor and he made it into a liquid kind of substance, that's a whole different issue whatsoever. So that even though back on Daf Lamed Hey Amid Aleph at the end of the Amud, we quoted a brisa that himcho ugmao is chametzu onish kares, he is chayav kares, and it means that when the Torah says with regard to chametz v'nichus ha-nefesh ahimi Yisrael, nefesh includes even someone, the Gemara tells us in Chulin, who drinks the chametz, and chametz that's being drunk because it was dissolved, so to speak, to some extent in water, he'll be chayav for kares, for chametz. But Reish Lakish is talking about where there was never, in the original making of the dough, there was never water, there's no agent of water, and therefore the fermentation of yayin, shemen, or dvash is only at best a partial chimutz. It would not generate kares. It might be osur doraisa if you hold the chametz nuksha is osur doraisa, or it might be mutter according to Torah law. As far as matzah is concerned, certainly it's excluded from matzah. It's called matzah shira. It's not lechem oni, because lechem oni means dough that's made out of wheat, flour, water, and no other admixtures of juices. So now we're up to Dmai. This is on the second line on Daf Lamed Hey Amid Beis. The Mishnah says that a person can fulfill his chiyuv matzah by eating matzah's Dmai. So the Gemara asks, V'holo chazile, isn't this also what we would call a mitzvah haba ba'avera? You're not allowed to eat Dmai. The Rabbanan enacted that we don't eat Dmai that's tfua, that's bought from an Amoritz. We're worried about the possibility that the seller, who was an Amoritz, was not mafresh trumas of meisers. And the Gemara answers, if a man would make his possessions ownerless, declare them as hefker, then he becomes an ani, because he has no assets in his bank, and therefore he'd be allowed to eat Dmai, because Dmai was enacted only for Ashirim, but not for Aniyim. Is therefore Havi Ani v'ochel Dmai is allowed to eat Dmai, Hashtanami, even though now he has not exercised that theoretical possibility of being mafkir's nechasiv. Nevertheless, it's not considered what we call a complete Easter. It's chazile. It's something normal in Easter. Like, for example, if you have a heft of macholas asuros of any sort, there's no way that you can eat this under again, you can change it, but as is now, you can't eat it. But in the case of Dmai, without even having to change it, you might be able to eat it. You'd be permitted to eat it in a case where you made yourself into an ani by being mafki nechas. Now, how do we know what's the source that Dmai is mutal aniyim? The Snam, we learned through the Mishnah, third parak, Dmai machinas aniyim Dmai. And not only that, es hachsanya Dmai, when you have soldiers, Jewish soldiers, who are out there protecting the cities from enemies on the outside, and they really are sustaining the city, they're protecting the city, then the Chachamim say they don't have to run around and be mafresh trumas and maisis. They can just buy local grains and local breads from Amioretz, and they're not chayiv for dman. V'yomer Rav Huna says that the Bryce actually records Machlokes Beis Hillel Beit Shammai about this very point. Is an ani allowed to eat dmai? Are the Anshe Tzava Yisraelim muter lechol dmai? Beit Shammai omrim ein machilin es hanim dmai ve'es hachsanya dmai. Beis Hillel omrim machilin. Our Mishnah reflects the shita of Beis Hillel that an ani is allowed to eat dmai. And I remember my days in high school when I learned with Rabbi Braunspiegel Shlita, and he told us that he believes what the Gemara is trying to point out is that Tmai is only an Isa Gavra, not an Isa Chefza. It's not really a Chefza D'Isura, even Mirabanan, and therefore the Chefza itself is Hetera. That's why it's kosher for matzah. Now, just by way of introducing the next sugya, and we touched on this in the first part of Ashir on Amid Aleph, there's a Seder of Hafroshim, which would begin with Truma, and then we go on to Maaseh, which means that the Levi, when he gets his Maaseh, he's only getting 9.8, meaning 2% were removed. He's going to get 10% of the remaining 98. Now, the Levi might be tempted to want to take his Maaseh before the Hafrosh's Trumas and Maaseh, because then he'll get a full 10% of the payros of the Balabais. And that's called Hikdimo Bishibolim. So the Gemara asks, Maser Rishon Shenitla Trumaso, after the Hafrosh's Trumas Maser is Onam Yotzi Dechovaso Bepesach, Pshita, Tekevon Shenitla Trumaso, Chulin Havi. If Truma was already taken, then it's Chulin. And if it's Chulin, of course, you can be Yotzei Matzah with Chulin. Lo Tzricha, what's the case of our Mishnah and what's the Chiddush of our Mishnah? Is Hikdimo B'Shibolin. The Hafroshas Maser Rishon was implemented before the Hafroshas Truma Gedola. And then Nitla Mimenu Heimenu Trumas Maser, so that the Levi received Maser, exactly 10% of the produce of the Balabayas. From that 10%, he was Mafresh Truma, which is called Trumas Maser for the Kohen. But Lo Nitla Mimenu Truma Gedola, from those payros, those grains that he received as 10% from the Balabayas as Maser Rishon, there was never Truma Gedola taken off of those grains. And why is it that it's mutter to eat this as matzah, and it's not matzah bo b'avera? The answer is Kid Rabbi Avod. Yomer Rabbi Avod, Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Maser Rishon shekdimo b'shibolim, potter v'truma gedola. We're going to derive from a drasha, from a pasuk, that if Maser Rishon was taken before truma gedola, then, although that's certainly prohibited, but the status after truma gedola, I'm sorry, if Truma Gedola wasn't taken, but the status of the Maser is that you don't take off Truma Gedola from Maser, and therefore it's mutter. Hence, you Yotze Yidei Chovas Matzah. Shenemar, where do we derive this conclusion from in the Pasha Maser Rishon? It says, Varimosem Mimenu Trumas Hashem Maser Min HaMaser. In other words, when the Torah formulates the chiyuv on the Levi to take Maser from his Maser, which is called Trumas Hashem, it says Maser Min HaMaser, Amarti L'cha, you take Maser from Maser, Vot V'lo Truma Gedola V'Trumas Maser Min HaMaser. You might think that the Levi now has to make up for the loss of the Kohen, that the Kohen was cheated out of his Truma, meaning Truma Gedola as we call it, and therefore the Levi has to pay up to the Kohen two things. Let him take off his Trumas Maser, his Maser Min HaMaser, and in addition, he's got to make up the difference of the 2% of Truma that was coming to the Kohen and was never given to the Kohen. Kamash Balon, the Torah says, Maser Min HaMaser, V'lo Truma Gedola Min HaMaser. Why do you tell me Hikdimo B'Shibolim, meaning the Levi took his 10% prematurely when there was no advanced process of what we call Kri? Let's explain. The original process is to harvest the grains, and then we do what's called Meruach. and Kri, we do a winnowing process to remove the chaff, and then what falls down is the grains without the chaff, and we smooth them out into a pile, into a beautiful stack, and that's called Kri. Is what happens if after the Tvua reached that stage, that's advanced stage, and it was already Kri, and at that point there was a chiyuv hafrashas trumas and masros, because the Torah says degoncha, and degoncha digun means after meruach, and at that moment in time, before the Yisrael was mafresh truma gedola, the Levi stepped in and took his maser. Why not assume that that also was excluded from a chiyuv truma gedola and from being tevel and also because the Torah says maser mina maser? Abai says Alecha Makra. That's why the Torah in this parsha adds Mikol matnosechem torimu es trumas Hashem. Kol trumas Hashem. It says kol is always a ribui to include. In this case, he's saying that any kind of possibility of truma has to be given to the Kohen. Torimu kol truma Hashem, and that's coming to include a case where the Levi preempted the Kohen, took his maser after the Kri was formed, and in a sense cut out the Kohen from getting his truma. So Gemara asks, "My chazos, why do you put the boundary line at Kri, as if to say, if it's shibolim, then we have the first drasha of maser min maser, where there's no truma from maser, and then when you get to the second stage of Kri, at that point, you read the pasuk Kol Truma Hashem, and that includes even in the case of Ikdimo, where the Levi took his maser prematurely. The Gemara answers, "Hi idgan, v'hai lo idgan." When the Torah says Reishis deganecha, titen lo, it means that the chiyuv trumas and maasros emerges with digun, which is only after meruach. But high in the case of Maser, which he took from Shibolim, is lo idgan. It's premature. There's no chiyuv truma gedol at all. Why? Because it never reached the stage of digun, which is meruach. It was only in the premature state, its natural state of Shibolim. Masha enkein, if it's already in the state of Kri, and therefore it's considered diguncha, it's after meruach, it's gemar malacha, it's ready and ripe for hafrashas truma. Now, if the Levi jumps in and he takes his maser before truma gedola, when there's already a chiyuv truma gedola inherent, then we apply the principle of kol truma Hashem, and that teaches us that even in this case, where he took the maser, somehow the Kohen have to be paid up with his truma. We go on in the Mishnah. The Mishnah mentions Maser Sheni v'Hegdesh and Nifdu, and the Gemara says Pshita. Why would I think otherwise? After all, after P'dia, the Maser Sheni or the Hegdesh is Chulin Gmurin. Hachamayaskinon kishenasen es hakeren v'lo nasen es hachomesh. The Torah requires for Pidyon Hegdesh or Pidyon Maser Sheni that he add an additional 20%, and that's called Chomesh. In the case of Hegdesh, the Torah says at the end of Sefer Yukum Himamagdish Yigal es Beisov v'Yosaf Chamishis Kesef Erkacha Olav Hayalo. In the parsha of Maser Sheni, it says Vim Gaal Yigal Ishmi Masar Chabishaso Yosef Olav. This man was podeh his Hegdesh or his Maser Sheni without adding an extra chomesh, and in that case, we would think that until he adds the extra chomesh, the pidyon process is invalid. Chomash malon di'ein chomesh ma'akev. That although the podeh is obligated as a chomesh gavra to add another 20% of chomesh, but nevertheless that's not critical. The pidyon is meaningful and operative even in the absence of a chomesh, and therefore you could be yotzei yechiyuv matzah with Hegdesh or Maser Sheni money or Maser Sheni grains that were subject to pidyon even without paying up a chomesh. Then it says Kohen b'chala b'truma, that a Kohen could be yotzei his mitzvah of matzah with truma. or challah pshita. Why would I think otherwise? Again, it's cool in gemurin. It's pure heter. What's its disqualification for matzah? The same I might have thought that matzah shavel chol oda be'inon. In order to fulfill a chovas matzah, you'd have to have matzah that's roy, that's suitable for everybody. But if you're not a Kohen, you can't eat this matzah. Kamash Malon, the Torah teaches us matzos. It says matzos many times in the Torah. Ribu, as a ribu, to teach us that even a matzah, which is only mutter to the Kohen and not to anyone else, is still valid as matzah. And we have a havamina here that matzah has to be shavel chol adam, which is very interesting because the Torah sometimes does require, as a precondition, shavel chol adam, not in the case of matzah, and that's only derived from matzos riba. But for example, in Melechas Chol Nefesh on Shabbos, it's got to be shavel chol nefesh, and we have many other examples of that. And we thought matzah would fit that bill, and you need shavel chol adam. Imagine just psychologically, if you were to serve matzah at a Seder table and you're a Kohen, but you invited a guest and he's not a Kohen, and you have to make sure if this matzah came from Truma to Challah, make sure he knows not to eat from this matzah. So anyway, we would have thought that maybe those matzahs are out. You know, it's very nice that you're a Kohen and you're a big shot, you made matzah out of Challah, but it's excluded. But we have a special ribui, matzos ribui. Continuing the Mishnah of Avolo b'tevel. You cannot fulfill your mitzvah of matzah with matzah shel tevel. Once again, pshita. We know that if you were to eat this matzah of tevel, which is prohibited with a very severe, stringent iser, you would be makayim your mitzvah with an avera. We have a principle that mitzvah b'ava avera is not a mitzvah. Lo tzricha. The Mishnah wants to teach us b'tevel tavu midrabanu. If we have something called an otzitz, which is a flower pot, Eino nakuf, it's not perforated. So that means that whatever grows in the flower pot is not connected to the ground at all. And the Chiv Trumas of Masros emerges from the growth of the grains from the ground. But the Rabbanan said that we don't want to confuse a perforated flower pot with a non-perforated flower pot, meaning if we allow you to get away with hafrashas trumas of masros, in the case of an otzis she'eno nakuv, you might mistakenly think even it's nakuv. Now, if it's perforated, then because of the holes on the bottom of the flower pot, that which is inside the flower pot, those seeds are nurtured from the ground itself. They have a din of mechubel karka. They generate a real, full-fledged, genuine chiyuv trumas of masros. And now, in the case of an otzis she'eno nakuv, it's only tevel b'drabanan. Now, on a deraisa level, it's not asur. The Rabbanan asur it, but that's enough to undermine the candidacy of this matzah for the mitzvah of be'erev tochlu matzahs. And it becomes a mitzvah b'ava avera despite the fact that it's only an avera d'Rabbanan. That's the chiddush of our Mishnah. Then the Mishnah tells us, v'lo b'maser rishon shelo nitlo trumasa. And once again, if the lady has maser and he hasn't been mafresh his maser mina maser, his trumas maser, to give it to the Kohen, then he has tevel, for sure it's not viable for matzah because you'd be violating a severe iser of tevel if you ate it. Shita lo tzricha shekdimo b'kri. The case is where the Levi, in effect, cut out the Kohen after the Tvua reached the state of Kri, which means it's digun, and it generates a chiyuv trumas of masras. It's tevel gomel. Maldatem, I would have thought that in such a case, maybe the Levi is not chayav in hafrashas truma, meaning of the truma gedola. I'm not talking about the maser bin a maser, and therefore, in the absence of maser bin a maser, in the absence of truma gedola, it would not be tevel. Kida Omale Rav Papa Abaye, and Rav Papa, if you remember, asked Abaye, well, why not pater him up from Truma even in a case of Kri, of Ikdima B'Kri? Kamash Malon Kiddushani lay, just like Abaye answered Rav Papa earlier, that Digun is the cutoff point, and once it reaches Kri, there's a full-fledged Chi of Trumas and Masras, and therefore it's Tevel, and until the Kohen gets his due of Truma, you cannot use this dough made of Maser min Maser before Truma Gedola was taken if it's Ikdima Bekri as Matzah. The Mishnah says, Velo b'Maser Sheni v'Hegdesh shelo niftu pshita. Again, we're not allowed to eat Hegdesh and certainly not Maser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim without Pidyon. Why would I think in the Havamim that you could fulfill your mitzvah of matzah with Maser Sheni or Hegdesh that was not subject to Pidyon? Says the Gemara, in order to justify the Chiddush Mamish, you have to assume we owned the Niftu, there was a Pidyon. My low Niftu, the Mishnah says explicitly there was no Pidyon. Shalo Niftu Kihil Chasan. He did not fulfill the Pidyon the way the Torah wants you to fulfill the Pidyon. And that means the following: Maser Sheni shepida'o al gabi asimon. Instead of using minted coins that are valid currency and that are backed up by the government, he used an asimon, which in slang we used to call it a slug, meaning it's a flat kind of piece of metal. We used to use it here in Israel for the public phones, if you remember that, if you're dating yourself. But in any event, an asimon has value, you buy it, but it doesn't have the status of kesef. And Rahman Amar, the Torah says in the parsha of Pidyon Maser Sheni, it says V'tzarta kesef biyodecha. And by adding the word kesef to the word V'tzarta, that combination teaches you what kind of kesef would qualify for Pidyon Maser Sheni. It's only a dover sheyesh lo tzura, that the word V'tzarta is not just a verb describing, putting all these coins after Pidyon into a bag and taking them to Yerushalayim. V'tzarta means kesef sheyesh ba tzura. It has a mint. And in the case of asimon, it doesn't have a mint, and therefore the Pidyon is not chal. It's completely invalid, and therefore its status is that of Hegdesh. And now we apply a similar kind of idea to, it still has status of Maser Sheni, now we apply a similar idea to Hegdesh. Hegdesh shechilu al gabi karka. Instead of transferring the ownership and redeeming the Hegdesh onto the taltal and movable objects, he did it onto karka, real estate. The Rachmana Amar, the Torah says at the end of Vayikra, v'nasan hakesef v'kamlo. And Hegdesh is not mischalel. You cannot be mechalel Hegdesh through Pidyon unless it's a dover hametaltel kekesef and nasan hakesef v'kamlo, but not karka. So the Mishnah wants to tell us that since the Pidyon here was invalid and there was no chil kedushas Hegdesh or Maser Sheni in the case of asimon, therefore he's not yotze yidei chavasa b'matzah. He is still violating an iser if he would eat this matzah of Hegdesh or Maser Sheni. Tana Rabbana. We learned in the Brayso, Yachol Yotze Adam Yidei Chavasa B'Tevel Shelo Niskan. I might have a meaning that you could fulfill your obligation of matzah with tevel, even if it wasn't subject to hafrasha. So wait a second. What are you telling me? It's tevel, and it's shelo niskan. I mean, that's what tevel means. Tevel means before you were mafresh, before the takana. Some called tevel nami lo niskan. Ella, but rather, what is the Brayso referring to? It's tevel shelo niskan called sarko. It was not done properly. In other words, the hafrasha was not done properly. Now, what does that mean? Kigon, for example, shenitla mimenu truma gedola, v'lo nitma mimenu trumas maser. Or, maser rishon v'lo maser sheni. Vafilu, even if it was subject to both truma and maser, but maser ani was not taken off. And in all these cases, he's not yotze the mitzvah of matzah. And the Brayso means to teach us that if you're missing any of the above, whether it's truma gedola, whether it's in the case of the Levi trumas maser, in the case of a Yisrael, it's Maser Rishon, or perhaps Maser Sheni, or perhaps Maser Adi. If any of the above are missing, then there's no possibility of considering it miskan and removing the Isur Tevel. It remains Tevel, and therefore it's excluded from Matzah. The Brisa continues by asking a rhetorical question, Minayin. How do we know that you're not Yotze the mitzvah of Matzah with Tevel? Tamaloma, the Torah says in Dvarim Tezayin, Lo Sochal of Chometz, and then the pasuk says Shivas Yomim Tochal of Matzos, and there's a hekeshe between Chometz and Matzah. Misha Isura Mishum Bal Tochal of Chometz. If you have something that could become Chometz and it would be also B'Toras Chometz, then Yotza, you can use it for Matzah. But Yotza, we exclude Zeh, meaning Tevel. If Tevel became Chometz, Ein Isur Mishum Bal Tochal Chometz, El Mishum Bal Tochal Tevel. Now the Gemara seems to assume, if you take this Gemara literally, as the Gemara is going to do right now, that in this case of Tevel, he violates the Isur of Achilas Tevel and he does not violate the Isur of Chometz. So the Gemara immediately objects, Isur de Chometz Leichan Azla. Just because it's Tevel, that doesn't remove its Isur Chometz. Or Rav Sheshes, the Gemara says, in the name of Rav Sheshes, that we invoke the principle of Rav Shimon, that if it became Tevel before the Chimutz, so that historically, chronologically, we started as Tevel and only later did it become Chometz. Hamani Rabbi Shimon Diomer Ein Isur Chal al Isur. Once the Isur of Tevel was Chal on these payros, you cannot superimpose a second Isur of Chometz when it becomes Chometz because of Ein Isur Chal al Isur. And the Gemara holds that it's only Rabbi Shimon who holds that you cannot be Yotze Matzah with the Isur Tevel in it, based on a hekesh between matzah and chametz. The Chachamim rejected Rav Shimon, and they hold that in this case, chametz is what's called an isur kolel. It adds something to tevel, and therefore the isur of chametz would be chal. And when the Mishnah says you're not yotze matzah with a matzah of tevel, then we're going to paskin like the Chachamim against Rabbi Shimon, and it could be, therefore, l'halacha, you could be yotze your mitzvah of matzah with matzah's tevel, and we're going to say that the isur of chametz is now an isur kolel, and therefore it's primarily an isur chametz. Now, just to end the shir, let's just read a few lines more. This Sanya we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Shimon Omer, here we're on the top of Lamed Vav, Lamed Aleph. Ha'ochel nevela b'yom ha'kippurim potur. Rabbi Shimon holds that since it was nevela before you entered into Yom Kippur, we're going to apply the principle of ein isur chal lisa, so you're not going to be chayav if you ate it on Yom Kippur. Normally, if you violate Yom Kippur and you eat on Yom Kippur, you're chayav a chatos b'shogeg. Here, you're not going to be chayav a chatos b'shogeg because the Isur Yom Kippur cannot be chal on top of the Isur Nevela, and that's ein isur chal lisa. And now we're going to apply that same logic to the case of chametz shel tevel, that since the Isur chametz is not chal, which means, just 1 second, let me just read it to you. He says that ain, according to Rabbi Shimon, ain isur yom kippurim chal al isur nevela, and therefore ain isur chametz chal al isur tevel. Now, what about the Chachamim Shita? They disagree with Rabbi Shimon, and they have an isur kolel, which is chal on top of the previous isur. Means if the second isur adds other, shall we call it chatichos nosofos, that were not included in the first isur, then the second isur would be chal. So that Mitoksha isu chal chatichos no sofas areu chal gam al osa chatichos shekvar nesra b'isur rishon. Therefore, ha'ochel nevelim Yom HaKippurim, Yom HaKippurim now is an isu kolel, because even as far as this, vis-a-vis this nevela is concerned, Yom Kippur doesn't generate a new isur, but nevertheless, since Yom HaKippurim comprises all of macholim, anything in the world that's edible, therefore it's an isur kolel, and once it's also vis-a-vis those other segments that are not nevela, it's chal also on the nevela. Therefore, according to Chachamim, in the case of chametz shel tevel, since the isur of chametz is something that generates all chametz in the world, and therefore its scope is that much greater than tevel itself. Tevel only applies to tevel, but chametz would apply to anything, even if it's not tevel. And therefore, the Chacham would say in such a case, Adam yotze yedei chovas matzah shel tevel b'Pesach, because it's an isur kolel, and it would, even if it was chametz, generate an isur chametz. Ravina Amar afilu tema rabbanon. We could interpret this brisa, even according to the Rabbanan who hold that the Isur Chametz is Chal on Tevel, because Chametz is an Isur Kolel, it applies to all Chametz in the world, not just to Tevel. But nevertheless, you cannot be Yotzei Matzah. Why not? Because to be Yotzei Matzah, it's only Misha Isura Mishum Bal Tochal Chametz Bilvad. We can interpret this hekesh, that what is valid for matzah, only that which is aser potentially, had it leavened mishum matzah, but only exclusively mishum chametz. It would have been aser mishum chametz. Yotza zeh, but in the case of matzah shel tevel, shem eini sur mishum bal talchal chametz bilvad af mishum bal tochal tevel, there would be a second iser in addition to tevel, and that's chametz. Or let's say it the other way around. In addition to chametz, there'll be an isur tevel, and that's not included in this pasuk, because according to Ravina, we need something that's exclusively asur b'toras chametz, but not in addition to another isur, namely tevel. The Gemara rejects this and says, midei bilvad ksiv. Where does the Torah say that this matzah, which could have become chametz, would have been asur only exclusively b'toras chametz? And therefore, machvarta ki de Rav Sheshes. We go back to the shita of Rav Sheshes and his drasha, namely that the reason why matzah's tevel will be excluded is because ein isur chal isur, since it's tevel, and it was tevel before it came chametz, it cannot become asur b'toras chametz, hence it's excluded from matzah. That's the only drasha which the Gemara is going to accept lehalach. Okay then, so at this point we have completed the daf for today, for Shabbos, Parshas Vayigash, and that is Lamed Hey. Tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem, will begin B'li Neder here on Lamed Vav with Tanu Rabbanu, which is approximately 7 lines down from the top of the